a werewolf shifter romance, specially written for you. Prologue. The pact was sealed not with blood, but with rot. 3 centuries before the Moonstone Pact settled the territory, a schism tore through the ancient shifter clans. One faction, the Purists, believed their power should remain untainted by human influence. The other, the Pragmatists, sought a fragile, mutually beneficial peace with the burgeoning human settlements. When the Purists refused to yield, the Pragmatists, desperate to enforce their treaty, turned to a magic so dark it had been outlawed even by the old gods, the manipulation of primal decay. In a hidden cavern beneath the roots of a colossal ancient oak, the Pragmatist shaman, a grim-faced she-wolf named Lyra, stood before a pulsating obsidian altar. Her hands, already blackened by the magic she wielded, hovered over a crystalline vessel filled with the concentrated essence of 1,000 years of forest rot. Around her, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and dying things. "This is not a curse," Lyra whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of her choice. "It is a weapon, a deterrent. It will not kill the flesh, but it will starve the spirit. It will make the land itself reject the uncooperative." With a final, agonizing push of will, she channeled the dark energy into the vessel. The crystal glowed with a sickly, emerald light, and a low, resonant hum vibrated through the earth. This was the shadow blight, a slow-acting magical contagion designed to weaken the shifting ability of any werewolf who opposed the pact, binding them to the land and draining their vitality. It was the ultimate enforcement mechanism, a magical leash on their own kind. Once the weapon was complete, the Pragmatists, horrified by the power they had unleashed, sealed the vessel within the altar. They knew the blight was too dangerous to be used, but too powerful to be destroyed. They buried the cavern, erased the maps, and swore an oath of silence, hoping the earth would hold their terrible secret forever. The last thing Lyra saw before the cavern entrance collapsed was the faint, sickly green glow emanating from the obsidian altar, a silent promise of rot waiting for the day it would be called upon again. The pact was sealed, and the weapon was sleeping, deep beneath the roots of what would one day become the Moonstone territory. Chapter 1. The Fading Territory. The air in the Moonstone territory no longer smelled of pine and damp earth. It smelled of slow, creeping decay. It was a scent Elara Vane knew intimately, a bitter, metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat and seemed to seep into the very marrow of her bones. It was the smell of the shadow blight, and it was the smell of her life. Elara stood on the periphery of the pack's main clearing, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her threadbare tunic. At 18, she should have been a vibrant, powerful young woman, her body taut with the potential energy of her wolf form. Instead, she was slight, almost fragile, a shadow at the edge of the light. She was a Null-Wolf, a genetic anomaly who could not shift. While every other member of the Moonstone Pack possessed the primal, exhilarating ability to shed their human skin and run free, Elara remained stubbornly, shamefully human. The pack's communal hunt had just returned, but the mood was somber. The deer they dragged in was meager, its coat patchy, its flesh already showing signs of the blight's influence, a faint, sickly discoloration beneath the fur. The shifters themselves looked little better. Their movements were sluggish, their eyes dull, and the glorious muscular forms of their wolves were noticeably thinner than they had been a year ago. The blight was a slow poison, draining the vitality from the land and consequently from the shifters who drew their strength from it. "Look at her, still standing there like a scarecrow," sneered Torvin, a young beta in training as he passed. He was one of Elara's younger cousins, a boy whose wolf had come in early and strong, making him feel perpetually superior. "The blight is killing us, and the curse that caused it just stands and watches." Elara did not flinch, but the words were a physical blow. She had learned long ago that silence was her only defense. Any retort, any sign of pain, only fueled their contempt. She was the living embodiment of their fear, the visible sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the Moonstone bloodline. Her father, Alpha Kale, stood near the fire pit, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his title. He was a once mighty man, but the Blight had aged him a decade in a single year. He caught Elara's eye for a fleeting moment, and in that glance she saw not the fierce love of a father, but a deep, weary resentment. She was his failure, the flaw in his perfect lineage, and now, in the pack's darkest hour, she was the easiest answer to a question no one dared to ask. Why is this happening to us? Elara turned away from the clearing, walking toward the dilapidated cabin she shared with the pack's elderly healer. She preferred the solitude, the quiet rot of the woods, to the loud, festering resentment of her own kind. The air grew heavier with the metallic tang as she walked, a constant, bitter reminder of her burden. She was the Null-Wolf, and in the Moonstone territory she was already dead. The air in the Alpha's den was thick with the scent of fear and stale authority. Alpha Kale sat behind a rough-hewn table, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the flickering oil lamp. Before him stood the Moonstone Pack's Council of Elders, their faces etched with a mixture of panic and self-righteous fury. The Blight had not only weakened their bodies, but had eroded their patience, turning them into desperate, superstitious men. "The signs are clear, Alpha," rasped Elder Rorik, the oldest and most influential of the group, his voice a dry, brittle sound. Rorik was the true villain, though Kyle did not yet know it. "The spirits are angered. The land is rejecting us. We have prayed, we have fasted, and still the rot spreads. We need a sacrifice, a cleansing." Kale ran a hand over his face, the gesture one of profound exhaustion. "Rorik, we are shifters, not ancient tribesmen. The Blight is a magical contagion, not a temper tantrum from the spirits. We need a cure, not a ritual murder." "And where is your cure, Alpha?" Rorik countered, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Where is the strength of your wolf? You yourself struggle to hold your form. The weakness is genetic, Kale. It began with her." He did not need to name Elara. Every man in the room knew who he meant. The other elders murmured in agreement. They were terrified. The Blight was slowly stripping them of the one thing that defined them, their ability to shift. In their panic, they sought the simplest answer, the easiest target. Elara, the Null-Wolf, was the perfect vessel for their fear. "She is my daughter," Kyle said, his voice low and strained. "She is a flaw in the bloodline," Rorik spat, "a sign of corruption. The Blight started shortly after she came of age. She is the anomaly, the unholy thing that draws the rot to us. You must cast her out, Kale. Brand her, exile her, and let the spirits see that we are willing to excise the sickness from our heart." The pressure was immense. Kale looked at the faces of his council. Not one of them met his gaze with loyalty, only with desperate expectation. He was their alpha, but they were the pack, and their fear was a physical force that threatened to tear his leadership apart. If he refused, they would challenge him, and in his weakened state, he would lose. The pack would fracture, and the Blight would consume them all. He thought of Elara, slight and quiet, always on the edge of the clearing. He remembered the resentment he felt every time he looked at her, the constant reminder of his failure to produce a perfect heir. He had tried to love her, but the pack's scorn had poisoned his affection. Now he saw a way out, a desperate, terrible bargain. He could save the pack, save his position, and perhaps save himself from the impossible choice of finding a cure. Kale slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. His eyes, usually a fierce gold, were clouded with a terrible, defeated gray. "Enough," he growled, the alpha command still holding a vestige of power. "I will not murder my own blood, but I will not see the Moonstone Pack destroyed by a curse that festers among us. You want a cleansing? You will have one." He looked directly at Rorik, a cold, terrible resolve settling in his features. "She will be branded. She will be exiled. She will be cast out into the whispering woods, and the spirits will see that the sickness has been removed. Prepare the altar for the ceremony at dawn. Tell the pack that the Alpha has made his decision. The elders exchanged relieved, triumphant glances. Rorik's thin lips curled into a barely perceptible smile. The sacrifice had been named. The underdog was about to be betrayed. Kale had chosen the pack over his daughter, and the stage was set for Elara's journey to begin. Chapter 2. The Scapegoat. The dawn was a sickly, bruised purple, mirroring the mood of the Moonstone pack gathered in the clearing. The air was cold, but the tension was a suffocating heat. A makeshift altar had been erected, a rough slab of granite, and Elara stood before it, her hands bound with thick silver-laced rope that burned her skin. She had been roused from her sleep before the first light, given no explanation, only the cold, hard fact of her fate. The entire pack was present, their faces a sea of grim expectation. They were not celebrating, they were desperate. They were performing a necessary surgery on their own body, and Elara was the infected limb. Alpha Kale stood opposite her, dressed in his ceremonial leathers, his face a mask of stone. He avoided her eyes, a cowardice that stung Elara more than the silver rope. Beside him, Elder Rorik stood with a triumphant, barely concealed smirk, holding a long iron rod with a crescent moon and scar pattern etched into its tip. The rod glowed faintly, having been heated in the dying embers of the council fire. "People of the Moonstone Pack!" Kale's voice boomed, strained but carrying the full weight of his alpha command. "The spirits have demanded a cleansing. The blight that poisons our land and weakens our wolves is a curse brought upon us by the flaw in our own bloodline. We must excise the sickness to save the whole." He paused, his eyes finally flicking to Elara, a moment of raw, agonizing pain flashing across his features before the mask snapped back into place. "Elara Vane, the Null-Wolf, you are the anomaly. You are the vessel of the rot. By the power vested in me as Alpha, I brand you an outcast. You are no longer daughter, sister, or pack member. You are the scapegoat." A collective, mournful howl rose from the pack, a sound that was less a condemnation and more a plea for their own survival. Rorik stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. He pressed the glowing iron rod against Elara's left shoulder. The pain was immediate, blinding, and absolute. It was not just the heat of the iron, but the searing, agonizing reaction of the silver to her skin, a pain that felt like her very soul was being ripped from her body. Elara bit down hard, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream. She would not be weak for them. Not now. When Rorik pulled the rod away, a smoking, angry scar, the crescent moon with the jagged scar, was burned into her flesh. It was the mark of exile, a permanent sign of her betrayal. Kale stepped forward, cutting the silver ropes. He shoved a small, rough-spun cloak into her hands and pointed toward the dense, blackening trees at the edge of the clearing. "Go," he commanded, his voice cracking with a finality that broke Elara's heart. "Go into the Whispering Woods. Never return to this territory. If you do, you will be hunted and killed as a rogue. May the spirits have mercy on your soul, for your pack has none left to give." Elara clutched the cloak, the silver burn throbbing a rhythm of betrayal against her skin. She looked at her father one last time, and in that moment, the last vestiges of her childhood love for him died. She saw only the weak, fearful man who had sacrificed his own blood for a desperate hope. Without a word, without a tear, she turned her back on the Moonstone Pack. She walked toward the Whispering Woods, the trees at the edge of the territory already black and skeletal, their branches twisted like grasping claws. The metallic tang of the shadow blight was overwhelming here, a thick, cloying miasma. As she stepped across the invisible boundary of the territory, the pack's mournful howl turned into a unified, triumphant roar. They had their sacrifice. Elara, the Null-Wolf, was gone. She was alone, an outcast with a burning scar, walking into the cursed heart of the forest. Her journey as the underdog had begun. The Whispering Woods lived up to their name. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every gust of wind carried a sound that was not quite a whisper, not quite a moan. The trees here were not merely dead. They were actively decaying, their bark sloughing off in wet black sheets, their branches brittle and sharp. The metallic tang of the shadow blight was so concentrated it felt like breathing rust. Elara stumbled deeper into the woods, the small, rough cloak offering little comfort against the cold. The silver burn on her shoulder throbbed with a relentless, fiery pain, a constant reminder of her father's betrayal. She was 18, alone, and had never been taught to hunt or survive outside the pack's protected borders. Her life had been one of quiet servitude, not wilderness training. As dusk deepened into a moonless night, Elara collapsed against the base of a massive, rotting oak. The Blight's energy, which had been a distant, bitter smell in the pack territory, was now a physical presence, a cold, heavy pressure that seemed to press the air from her lungs. It was the same energy that weakened the shifters, making their wolves thin and their shifts agonizing. She braced herself for the debilitating nausea and fever she had seen the others suffer when they ventured too close to the blighted edges. But the nausea never came. Instead, as the Blight's energy washed over her, something unexpected happened. The cold pressure did not crush her. It felt strangely familiar, almost right. It was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate not against her skin, but against the very core of her being, the empty space where her wolf should have been. I am a Null-Wolf, she realized, a sudden, shocking clarity cutting through her despair. The Blight is designed to poison the wolf, to drain the shifter's vitality, but I have no wolf to poison. Her weakness was her shield. The very thing that made her an outcast, her inability to shift, made her immune to the pack's greatest threat. A bitter, ironic laugh escaped her lips. They had cast out the only one who could walk freely in the rot. Driven by this strange new immunity, Elara pushed herself up and continued walking, drawn by a faint, unnatural glow in the distance. The Blight's energy was strongest here, and it was leading her. She walked for what felt like hours until she reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive, ancient oak, its roots twisting into the ground like the coils of a sleeping serpent. Beneath the roots, exactly as described in the prologue, was a fissure in the earth, leading down into a cavern. A sickly emerald light pulsed from the depths, illuminating the black, rotting wood around it. Elara recognized the place instantly, not from memory, but from a deep, primal sense of dread. This was the source, the heart of the contagion. This was the nexus of the shadow blight. She cautiously descended into the cavern. The air was heavy, but the metallic tang was replaced by a raw, intoxicating power. At the bottom, she found the obsidian altar, still pulsating with the faint, sickly green light from the sealed crystalline vessel within. It was the ancient shrine, the place where the blight had been created and sealed away centuries ago. As Elara reached out a trembling hand toward the altar, the raw, dark energy of the blight did not repel her. Instead, it flowed toward her, drawn to the void of her Null-Wolf nature. It was a power that had been waiting for a vessel that could not be corrupted, only filled. Elara Vane, the scapegoat, stood alone in the heart of the curse, and for the first time in her life, she felt a flicker of something other than shame. Power. Her transformation had begun. She was no longer just surviving. She was about to learn how to wield the very darkness that had been meant to destroy her. Chapter 3. Embracing the Shadow. The cavern was Elara's new sanctuary, a damp, subterranean cradle of forbidden power. The obsidian altar, with its sealed crystalline heart, pulsed a steady, hypnotic rhythm, a silent invitation to the darkness. Elara spent the first day simply watching it, the metallic tang of the blight, now a constant, almost comforting presence. She was starving. The cloak had offered no food, and the blighted woods yielded nothing edible. Survival demanded she move, but a deeper, more compelling hunger kept her rooted to the spot, the hunger for the power that thrummed beneath her fingertips. She knelt before the altar, placing her hand, not on the cool stone, but hovering just above the sickly green glow. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, searching for the deep, resonant hum she had felt the night before. The moment she connected, it was like plunging her hand into a river of liquid shadow. The energy was cold, ancient, and terrifyingly potent. It didn't feel like the clean, vibrant power of the moonstone shifters. It felt like the absence of life, the pure, distilled essence of decay. A wave of nausea finally hit her, not from the Blight's poison, but from the sheer wrongness of the power. She gasped, pulling her hand back, her skin tingling with a residue of cold. The Blight was not meant to be channeled. It was meant to be a slow, passive poison. To actively draw it was an act of magical violation. She tried again, this time with a focused intent. I need to survive. She pushed past the fear, past the instinct that screamed for her to run. She forced her mind to become a conduit, a vessel for the dark energy. The Blight rushed into her, filling the void of her Null-Wolf nature. It was an overwhelming sensation, 1,000 years of rot, of dying forests and failing shifters, compressed into a single, terrifying surge. Elara cried out, a sound that was instantly swallowed by the cavern's silence. Her vision swam. She felt a cold, sharp pressure behind her eyes, and a wave of shadow seemed to pour from her fingertips. She opened her eyes. The air around her hand was visibly darker, a swirling vortex of pure, concentrated blackness. It was not a shadow cast by light. It was a shadow made of energy. It was crude, uncontrolled, and utterly terrifying. In a panic, she tried to push the energy away, but it clung to her, an extension of her will. She focused on the nearest object, a small, dead root jutting from the cavern wall. She willed the shadow to touch it. The moment the swirling darkness brushed the root, the wood did not burn or break. It simply aged. In a matter of seconds, the root turned from brittle brown to fine gray dust, crumbling away as if a century had passed in an instant. Elara stared at the dust, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was not the brute strength of a wolf. This was something far more subtle, far more dangerous. She had not created fire or light. She had accelerated decay. She had touched the forbidden magic of the Blight, and it had answered. She was still the Null-Wolf, the outcast, the underdog. But now she was also a wielder of the shadow magic, a power that could rot the world. The realization was both a burden and a profound, exhilarating promise. She had survived the night, and now she had the means to survive the world that had cast her out. Her training had begun. The days that followed were a brutal, solitary apprenticeship. Elara had no mentor, no ancient texts, only the pulsating obsidian altar and the raw, dark energy of the Shadow Blight as her teacher. She learned through trial and error, through painful surges of power that left her trembling and exhausted, and through the sheer, desperate necessity of survival. Her first lesson was control. The power was volatile, eager to consume. She discovered that if she let her fear or anger guide her, the shadow magic would lash out, accelerating the decay of everything around her, including the very ground she stood on. She had to be cold, precise, and utterly focused, treating the Blight's energy not as a weapon, but as a tool. Her first practical application was fire. The blighted woods were damp and cold, and normal wood was too rotten to catch a spark. But Elara found that she could use a tiny, focused burst of decay magic to instantly age a piece of dead wood, stripping it of moisture and turning it into tinder-dry fuel. It was a small miracle, a warm, clean flame born from the essence of rot. Next came stealth. The Moonstone Pack had taught their young to move silently, relying on their wolf senses. Elara, lacking those senses, learned to manipulate the shadows themselves. By drawing the Blight's energy and weaving it around her, she could deepen the natural darkness, creating a cloak of pure, light-absorbing shadow. It was not invisibility, but a perfect mobile camouflage that allowed her to move through the woods unseen, a true shadow of the forest. Her greatest challenge was food. The blighted woods were barren. She could not hunt like a wolf, but she could scavenge. She used her shadow magic to accelerate the decay of fallen logs, attracting the few insects and grubs that thrived on the rot. It was a meager, disgusting diet, but it kept her alive. She even learned to use the magic to test the edibility of the few sickly berries she found, instantly aging them to dust if they were poisonous, or leaving them intact if they were safe. The transformation was physical as well as magical. The constant channeling of the dark energy began to change her. Her eyes, once a soft brown, now held a strange, unsettling depth, especially when she used her power. The silver scar on her shoulder, the mark of her exile, no longer burned with pain. Instead, it felt like a cold, solid anchor, a connection point to the Blight's power. The pack had branded her as a curse, and now she was embracing the role. One evening, as she sat by her small, controlled fire, cloaked in a perfect sphere of shadow, she realized she was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. The woods that were meant to be her tomb had become her training ground. The power that was meant to destroy her pack was now her only ally. She was still the underdog, but she was no longer weak. She was a master of the forbidden, a creature of shadow and decay, a Null-Wolf who had found her own, terrifying form of power. She was ready to leave the cavern and begin the next phase of her journey, to understand the true nature of the Blight and the betrayal that had cast her out. Chapter 4. The Iron City. Elara stood at the edge of the Whispering Woods, looking out at the sprawling, chaotic expanse of the Iron City. It was a jagged skyline of steel and glass, a monument to human ambition that seemed to mock the fading natural world of the shifters. She had spent weeks in the blighted forest, and the sheer noise and light of the city were an assault on her senses. Her goal was simple: information. The Blight was a magical weapon, and weapons had creators, motives, and histories. The Pack Elders had been useless, blinded by superstition. The only place to find the truth, she reasoned, was in the dusty, forgotten records of the human world, where the pact that birthed the Blight had been forged centuries ago. She pulled the rough cloak tighter around her, the fabric now stained and torn, but still a familiar comfort. The silver scar on her shoulder was hidden beneath the collar, a secret she guarded fiercely. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been cast out. She was a creature of the shadows, and she would use the darkness to navigate the light. The transition from the forest to the city was jarring. The air here was thick with the smell of exhaust and cheap food, a different kind of rot than the one she was used to. She moved with a practiced stealth, a skill honed by weeks of avoiding the blighted creatures of the woods. Her shadow magic was her most potent tool for blending in. As she walked down a narrow, bustling alleyway, she subtly drew on the Blight's energy, weaving a thin, almost imperceptible veil of shadow around her. It didn't make her invisible, but it made her forgettable. People glanced at her and immediately looked away, their minds refusing to register the slight dark-haired girl as anything important. She was just another shadow in the city's perpetual twilight. She found a small, independent library tucked away on a quiet side street, its windows dusty and its sign faded. It was the kind of place that smelled of old paper and neglect, a perfect repository for forgotten truths. Inside, the librarian, a frail, bespectacled man with a perpetually distracted air, barely glanced up as she entered. Elara used her shadow magic to deepen the shadows in the back corner of the history section, creating a small, private sanctuary where she could work. She began her search, not for werewolf lore, that would be too obvious, but for records of the region's history 3 centuries prior. She looked for mentions of treaties, land disputes, and most importantly, any reference to a sudden, unexplained magical event or a great schism among the local tribes. The books were heavy, the language archaic, but Elara was relentless. She spent hours poring over brittle pages, her fingers tracing lines of forgotten script. The Blight's energy, which she constantly channeled, kept her alert, a cold, dark caffeine in her veins. Finally, late in the afternoon, she found it. A brittle, leather-bound journal titled The Chronicles of the Iron Pact. The entry for the year in question spoke of a great cleansing of the wildlands, a magical deterrent used by the forest guardians to enforce a non-aggression treaty with the burgeoning human city. The text was vague, but the implication was clear. The Blight was not a curse from the spirits, but a calculated political weapon. The forest guardians were the pragmatist shifters from the prologue. Elara's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. Her pack had been lied to for generations. Her father had been lied to. And she, the innocent, had been sacrificed to appease a lie. She carefully copied the key passages, her hands steady, despite the tremor of rage running through her. The truth was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She now knew the what. The next step was to find the who, the faction that had created the weapon, and, more importantly, the why it had been reactivated now. Her search was far from over, but for the first time since her exile, Elara felt a sense of purpose that transcended mere survival. She was hunting the truth. Elara returned to the cavern, the copied passages from the Chronicles of the Iron Pact clutched in her hand. The library had given her the what and the why of the Blight's creation, but the most pressing question remained. Who had reactivated the ancient weapon? And why now? She spread the brittle copied pages on the cold stone floor near the altar, using a faint, controlled glow of shadow magic to illuminate the archaic script. She cross-referenced the human records with the vague, fearful legends she had overheard in the pack as a child, tales of a traitor's pact and a sleeping weapon. The human chronicle detailed the political climate of the time. The shifters who created the Blight were known as the Pragmatists, a faction obsessed with control and order. Their goal was to prevent the purest shifters from ever challenging the peace treaty with the Iron City. The Blight was their ultimate deterrent, a magical leash on their own kind. Elara's mind raced, connecting the historical dots to the present. The Blight was not a random curse. It was a targeted, internal weapon. It was designed to weaken the Alpha Line and destabilize the pack structure, making it ripe for a takeover. She thought back to the council meeting, to the desperate fear in her father's eyes, and the cold, calculated fury in Elder Rorik's. Rorik, the oldest elder, the one who had pushed hardest for the sacrifice, the one who had wielded the branding iron with such chilling satisfaction. He was the one who had insisted the Blight was a curse from the spirits, a narrative that conveniently masked its true nature as a political weapon. A sudden, terrifying realization hit her. Rorik was not just a fearful old man, he was a power-hungry opportunist. The Blight had been reactivated to weaken Alpha Kale, allowing Rorik to seize control under the guise of saving the pack. And Elara, the Null-Wolf, was the perfect disposable scapegoat to complete the illusion. She remembered the faint, almost imperceptible smile on Rorik's lips as her father had pronounced the sentence of exile. It was the smile of a man who had just won. The rage that filled Elara was cold and pure, a stark contrast to the hot, animalistic fury of a true wolf. It was the rage of the betrayed, the rage of the intellectual who had uncovered a devastating truth. Her father's betrayal was born of fear. Rorik's was born of ambition. She looked at the obsidian altar, the nexus of the Blight. She now understood that the Blight was not just a weapon, it was a tool of political control. And Rorik, a man who had been an elder for decades, would have had access to the pack's deepest, most guarded secrets. Secrets that might include the location of the sealed weapon and the means to activate it. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The Blight was not a curse that had chosen Elara. It was a weapon that had been aimed at her father, and she was simply collateral damage, a convenient distraction. Elara stood up, the shadow magic swirling around her hands in a controlled, dark vortex. She had the truth. The Blight was not a disaster. It was a coup. Her exile was not a sacrifice. It was a political assassination. The underdog was no longer running from a curse. She was hunting a traitor. Her purpose was now clear. She would return to the Moonstone territory, not to beg for forgiveness, but to expose the lie and confront the true source of the rot that was destroying her home. She had to save the pack, not for the pack's sake, but for the sake of the land and the innocent shifters who were being poisoned by a power struggle. The hunt was on. Chapter 5. The Watcher. Elara had spent the last few days in the cavern, not just practicing her shadow magic, but trying to understand the nature of the Blight itself. Her attempts to draw the energy were becoming smoother, the swirling darkness around her hands less volatile, but the power still felt alien, a cold, hungry thing that demanded respect. She was attempting to create a stable, solid form, a dagger of pure shadow, when a voice, dry and ancient as the cavern walls, cut through the silence. "You are drawing too much, little Null-Wolf. The Blight is not a wellspring, it is a hungry mouth. You feed it with your will, but it will eventually demand your soul." Elara spun around, the half-formed shadow dagger dissolving into smoke. Standing at the cavern entrance, silhouetted against the sickly green glow, was a figure she had never seen before. It was a woman, impossibly old, her skin like dried parchment stretched over sharp bones. She wore a cloak woven from moss and dried leaves, and her eyes, though cloudy with age, held a sharp, knowing intelligence. She carried a staff made of polished black wood that seemed to absorb the light. "Who are you?" Elara demanded, instinctively raising her hands, ready to summon the shadow magic. The woman chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "I am the Watcher. I have been here since the oak was a sapling, since the first pact was sealed. I watch the boarders, and I watch the fools who tamper with things they do not understand." She pointed a gnarled finger at the obsidian altar. "And you, child, are the most dangerous fool of all." Elara lowered her hand slightly. "I am not a fool. I am trying to understand this power. It is the only thing that can save my pack." "Save them?" The Watcher stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or rule them. The Blight is the magic of ambition, Elara. It is the power of the end. It accelerates decay, yes, but it also accelerates desire. You are immune to its poison, but not to its temptation. It is whispering to you now, telling you that the pack deserves to rot, that you should be their alpha, their dark queen." Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cavern air. The Watcher was right. A small, cold voice in her mind had indeed suggested that the pack deserved the fate they were bringing upon themselves. "How do I control it?" Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Watcher smiled, a slow, unsettling movement of her lips. "You do not control the Blight, child. You respect it. You use it only for purpose, never for pleasure. Your weakness, your lack of a wolf, is your strength. The wolf is fire, passion, and instinct. The Blight demands cold, calculating precision. You must be the Null-Wolf in your mind, as well as your body." For the next 3 days, the Watcher became Elara's reluctant mentor. She taught Elara to breathe with the Blight's energy, to feel the flow of decay in the woods, and to use her mind to shape the shadow magic into tools, not just weapons. She showed Elara how to create a perfect, stable sphere of shadow for light, and how to use the decay magic to instantly purify a small pool of water by accelerating the rot of the contaminants. "You are learning quickly," the Watcher admitted on the 3rd night, her tone still distant. "But remember this, Elara Vane. Every time you draw on the Blight, you are borrowing from the void. The void always demands payment. If you let your heart turn to rot, you will become the very curse they feared you to be. You will save the pack, but you will lose yourself." She handed Elara a small, smooth stone, black as obsidian, but warm to the touch. "This is a piece of the ancient oak. It will not stop the Blight, but it will remind you of the life that still exists outside the rot. Now go. You have the truth, and you have the power. The time for learning is over. The time for action has begun. Before Elara could thank her, the Watcher simply melted into the shadows of the cavern, leaving no trace of her presence but the lingering scent of moss and ancient earth. Elara clutched the warm stone, the mentor's warning echoing in her mind. She had a power that could save her people, but the cost was her soul. She knew she had to hurry. The pack was dying, and the darkness within her was growing stronger. With the Watcher's words echoing in her mind, Elara left the cavern. She moved with a newfound purpose, her steps silent, her form a mere suggestion in the forest's gloom. She was no longer wandering, she was stalking. Her destination was the border of the Moonstone territory, the invisible line she had been warned never to cross. Using the stealth granted by her shadow magic, she slipped through the trees until she reached a high ridge overlooking the pack's main clearing. She settled into the deep shadows cast by a blighted pine, the obsidian stone from the Watcher cool and grounding in her palm. The sight below was worse than she had imagined. The clearing, once a vibrant hub of activity, was muted, almost colorless. The shifters moved with a weary slowness, their faces drawn and their eyes hollow. The blight had intensified, its metallic tang now a choking smog that hung over the camp. She watched as a small group returned from a patrol. Among them was Torvin, her cousin, the beta in training who had sneered at her. He was leaning heavily on another shifter, his face pale. As he tried to shift back to his human form, his transformation was agonizingly slow, his wolf's fur patchy and dull. He collapsed to his knees, retching, unable to complete the shift. The blight was attacking the very core of their being, making the fundamental act of being a werewolf a source of pain and weakness. Then she saw her father. Alpha Kale was sitting alone by the dying embers of the fire pit, not in his usual place of authority, but slumped on a log. He looked frail, his once broad shoulders bowed. He was visibly ill, coughing a deep, wet cough that shook his entire frame. The blight was consuming him faster than the others, perhaps because he was the alpha, the one most deeply connected to the land. As she watched, Elder Rorik approached Kale, not with respect, but with a cold, proprietary air. He spoke to the alpha in low, condescending tones, clearly giving orders rather than advice. Kale merely nodded, too weak to argue, too defeated to fight. Rorik was already ruling the pack, using the blight as his silent, magical coup d'etat. A surge of conflicting emotions hit Elara. The cold, logical part of her, the part that wielded the shadow magic, whispered that they deserved this. They had betrayed her, sacrificed her to a lie, and now they were paying the price. The pack was rotting from the inside out, just as Rorik had planned. But then she saw a small child, a girl no older than 5, trying to play near the fire. The child's laughter was thin and weak, and her mother quickly pulled her away, terrified of the blight's pervasive influence. Elara thought of her own childhood, the brief, happy moments before the Null-Wolf curse had been confirmed. She thought of the land itself, the ancient trees and the spirit of the forest, which was being choked by the rot. Her decision solidified, cold and hard as the obsidian stone in her hand. This was no longer about revenge for her betrayal. It was about justice for the innocent and the land. She had the truth, and she had the power to stop the blight. To stand by and watch the pack die would be to allow Rorik's ambition to triumph. Elara Vane, the scapegoat, would return, not as a supplicant, but as a force of nature. She would expose the lie, confront the traitor, and save the pack that had cast her out. She pulled her shadow cloak tighter, her eyes, now glowing with a faint dark light, fixed on the clearing. The time for observation was over. The time for the Null-Wolf's return was at hand. Chapter 6. The Scapegoat's Return. Elara did not sneak back into the Moonstone territory. She returned with a statement. She stood at the exact spot where her father had cast her out, the boundary between the blighted, whispering woods and the pack's fading land. She was no longer wearing the tattered cloak he had given her. Instead, She was draped in a garment of her own making, a seamless, shifting cloak of shadow magic, a fabric woven from the pure, dark energy of the Blight. Her eyes, usually a soft brown, were now the color of polished obsidian, glowing with a faint internal green light. The silver scar on her shoulder was visible, a cold, dark crescent that pulsed faintly with the power she channeled. She raised her hands, and with a focused surge of will, she drew a massive amount of the Blight's energy from the surrounding woods. It coalesced above her, not as a weapon, but as a beacon, a swirling, silent vortex of black smoke and sickly green light that towered over the trees. It was a terrifying, undeniable display of power. The pack's reaction was immediate. A cacophony of confused, fearful howls erupted from the clearing. Shifters, weak and slow, stumbled out of their dens, staring in disbelief at the figure standing at the border. Elder Rorik was the first to arrive, followed by a handful of loyalists. He saw the figure, the power, and the unmistakable scar. His face, usually a mask of cold control, contorted in a snarl of pure, panicked rage. "The Null-Wolf! You dare return, rogue!" Rorik roared, his voice cracking with fear. He struggled to shift, his transformation halting at a half-man, half-wolf form, a pathetic, patchy creature. The Blight was weakening him too. Elara did not move. She let the shadow magic speak for her, the vortex above her head pulsing in response to her silent command. "I return for the truth." Elara's voice cut through the air, clear and cold, carrying a resonance that was not human, not wolf, but pure magic. "You lied to them, Rorik. You told them the Blight was a curse from the spirits. You told them I was the sickness. But I found the truth in the human city. The Blight is a weapon, a political tool, and you, Elder, are the one who activated it." The accusation hung in the air, a devastating blow to Rorik's carefully constructed lie. The pack members who had gathered began to murmur, their fearful eyes darting between the powerful, terrifying figure of Elara and the sputtering, half-shifted form of Rorik. Alpha Kale arrived last, supported by his younger son. He looked utterly defeated, his skin pale, his eyes sunken. He saw Elara, and a complex mix of shock, fear, and a flicker of desperate hope crossed his face. "Elara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You must leave. You will be killed." Elara ignored him, her gaze locked on Rorik. "I challenge you, Elder Rorik, not for the Alpha title, but for the truth. You have poisoned this land and betrayed this pack for your own ambition. I demand a public confrontation. If I am the sickness, let me prove it by cleansing the rot you brought here." Rorik knew he was trapped. To refuse the challenge would be to admit guilt. To accept would be to face a power he did not understand, a power that was immune to the very weapon he controlled. He glanced at Kale, seeing the Alpha's utter defeat, and decided to bluff. "She is mad. The Blight has consumed her mind," Rorik shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Elara. "She is a dark witch. Kill her now, before she destroys us all." But the pack hesitated. They saw the raw power in Elara, and they saw the desperate fear in Rorik. They had been lied to before. They would not be so quick to condemn the scapegoat again. "The pack will decide," Elara stated, her voice a final, cold decree. "Gather in the clearing at the next moonrise. I will bring the proof of your betrayal, Rorik, and I will show them the true source of the rot." With a final, contemptuous look at the Elder, Elara let the shadow magic vortex above her dissolve into nothingness. She turned and melted back into the shadows of the whispering woods, leaving the pack in stunned silence, the gauntlet thrown, and the stage set for the final, deadly confrontation. The moon was a sliver of silver, struggling to pierce the thick metallic haze that choked the moonstone clearing. The entire pack was gathered, a silent, anxious crowd. In the center stood Elder Rorik, his face a mask of false confidence, and Elara, cloaked in her shifting shadows, the obsidian stone clutched tightly in her left hand. "She is a liar!" Rorik shrieked, his voice hoarse. He pointed at Elara's scar. "Look at the mark of the curse. She has consorted with the rot. She is here to finish what she started." "I am here to finish what you started, Rorik," Elara countered, her voice calm and cold. She held up the copied pages from the Chronicles of the Iron Pact. "The Blight is not a curse. It is a weapon created by shifters like you to enforce a political agenda. And you, Elder, reactivated it to weaken Alpha Kale and seize control." Rorik abandoned all pretense. With a guttural roar, he finally achieved a full shift. A massive, patchy, sickly gray wolf, its movements slow and labored. "Then let the weapon decide," he howled, and with a surge of his own weakened magic, he summoned a wave of dark, blight-infused energy, a visible, toxic cloud aimed directly at Elara. Elara did not flinch. This was the moment of truth. She had trained for this. She drew on the Blight's energy, but instead of using it to attack, she used it to absorb. Her shadow magic flared, creating a vortex that sucked the toxic cloud into her body. The pain was immense, 1,000 needles of rot piercing her soul, but she held firm, her Null-Wolf nature acting as a perfect, hungry void. Rorik was stunned. His traditional brute force magic was useless against her. He lunged, a desperate physical attack. Elara moved with a speed born of pure, focused intent. She dodged the clumsy lunge, and, with a precise, controlled burst of shadow magic, she touched the ground at Rorik's feet. She didn't attack him. She attacked the magic that sustained him. She accelerated the decay of the earth beneath him, causing the ground to crumble and swallow his legs. "Pinned," Rorik screamed, not in pain, but in pure, unadulterated terror. "You cannot win! The Blight is everywhere! You can't stop it without destroying yourself!" "I know," Elara whispered, her voice filled with a terrible resolve. She looked past Rorik, past the pack, to the dying form of her father and the small, innocent child hiding behind her mother. She knew she could not simply defeat Rorik. She had to destroy the Blight's source. With a final, desperate surge, she channeled every ounce of her shadow magic, focusing it not on Rorik, but on the nexus point she had discovered in the cavern, the sealed crystalline vessel. She reached out with her mind, a cold, dark tendril of will, and commanded the Blight to return to its source. The ground beneath the clearing began to tremble. A sickly green light erupted from the earth, a massive column of pure, concentrated Blight energy shooting into the sky. It was the Blight's nexus, the core of the weapon, being drawn to the surface. Elara opened her arms, her obsidian eyes glowing with an unearthly light. She became the ultimate void, the hungry mouth the Watcher had warned her about. She pulled the entire column of toxic magical rot into herself. The pain was beyond anything she had ever known. It was the weight of 3 centuries of decay, the accumulated rot of 1,000 forests, rushing into her Null-Wolf core. She screamed, a silent internal scream that shook her to her very foundations. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. The green light vanished. The metallic tang in the air was gone, replaced by the faint, clean scent of pine. The ground stopped shaking. The trees at the edge of the clearing, though still scarred, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Elara collapsed, the obsidian stone falling from her hand. She was alive, but profoundly changed. The Blight was gone from the land, but it was now a permanent, cold presence within her. Her eyes remained obsidian, and the silver scar on her shoulder now glowed with a faint internal green light, a symbol of the darkness she had absorbed. Elder Rorik, stripped of the Blight's power, was left a pathetic, whimpering man, buried up to his waist in the crumbling earth. The pack stared, not at him, but at Elara, the Null-Wolf, who had just performed the ultimate act of sacrifice. The underdog had saved them all. The climax was complete. The epilogue, the scapegoat's moon. Weeks passed. The Moonstone territory was healing. The metallic tang of the Blight was gone, replaced by the fresh, clean scent of pine and damp earth. The shifters, no longer poisoned by the magical rot, were regaining their strength. Their shifts were smooth and powerful again, a testament to the sacrifice made in the clearing. Elder Rorik, stripped of his power and exposed as a traitor, was banished, his fate a slow, lonely death in the human world he had tried to exploit. Elara Vane, the Null-Wolf, lay recovering in the Alpha's den. She was no longer frail. The Blight's energy, though contained, had fundamentally changed her. Her skin was faintly paler, and her eyes remained the color of polished obsidian, glowing with a faint internal green light when she was tired or focused. The silver scar on her shoulder was now a permanent, cold symbol of her connection to the darkness. Alpha Kyle, recovering slowly, stood over her. He was still the Alpha, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound humility. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool, a coward. I chose fear over my own blood, and I chose a lie over the truth. You saved us all, and I branded you a curse." He knelt beside her cot, a gesture of submission that shocked her more than any of his past cruelties. "I beg your forgiveness, and I offer you your rightful place. You are no longer the Null-Wolf. You are the savior of the Moonstone Pack." Elara looked at her father, seeing the broken man beneath the Alpha's mantle. The resentment was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet understanding. "I forgive your fear, father," she said, her voice steady, "but I will not take a rightful place. That place was built on a lie. I will not be a Beta or a Luna or any title that binds me to the old ways." She sat up, the shadow magic stirring restlessly beneath her skin. The pack must learn the truth. They must know that their strength is not enough, and that the world is more complex than a simple shift. I will be the bridge between the light and the dark, between the pack and the wild. Kyle nodded, understanding the weight of her demand. "What title do you claim?" "I am the Shadow Keeper," Elara declared. "I am the guardian of the Blight, the one who holds the darkness so the pack can live in the light. I will protect the borders, not with a wolf, but with the power of the rot itself. And the pack will respect me, not out of love, but out of the knowledge that I am the only thing standing between them and the void." Kale agreed, and the pack, humbled and grateful, accepted the new order. The Null-Wolf, the scapegoat, was now the most powerful, most respected, and most feared member of the Moonstone Pack. That night, Elara stood alone on the ridge overlooking the newly healed territory. The full moon, a brilliant, clean silver, finally broke through the clouds. She felt the pull of the moon, a familiar aching emptiness where her wolf should have been. But now, it was accompanied by a different sensation, the cold, constant presence of the Blight within her. She reached out with her mind, and a thin, dark tendril of shadow magic snaked out from her hand, touching the ground. She felt the life returning to the soil, the slow, steady growth of the forest. She had saved them. But as she looked up at the moon, a new thought, cold and sharp, entered her mind. The Blight was contained, but it was not destroyed. It was a part of her now, a permanent, hungry passenger. The Watcher's warning echoed. The void always demands payment. Elara Vane, the Shadow Keeper, knew her journey was not over. She had saved her pack from the external threat, but the true battle, the battle to keep the darkness she held from consuming her soul, had just begun. The scapegoat's moon had risen, and the long night of her watch had begun.